Abandoned structures hold the secrets of America's past. A southern farmstead of unparalleled cruelty.
A lot of bad things happen here. And here we are today in the 21st century, still finding out about this hidden history.
A project to tame nature, built by the enemy's hands.
My father obviously took a lot of pride in his work, and I think all the people out here took a lot of pride in the work that they were doing because they understood why they were doing it.
And a factory which helped to build a new world.
This was the heart of all that happened in American industry and mass production.
Scattered across the United States are abandoned structures and those who know their stories. These forgotten ruins reveal the past of this land and its people. These are the secrets of hidden America. On Georgia's coast lies a ramshackle site, harboring one of America's darkest secrets.
The Sea Islands are a really beautiful area just off the coast of Georgia. On one of these islands, there's miles of empty fields and what looks like irrigation ditches in this strange settlement.
It's probably what a lot of people picture when they picture an old Southern house. It looks like a farmhouse. It's made of clapboard. It's weathered.
While nature has reclaimed much of the site, some buildings remain intact.
What's curious is there appear to be structures from different eras here. So you have an old brick chimney in front of a more modern construction.
This place is huge, nearly 1,500 acres in total. There looked like there were fields where people worked, and you have to wonder, what stories could they tell?
Today in the 21st century, I stand here as a descendant. Here the spirits are alive and well through those individuals that used to live here.
The interior of the main house gives some clues to what might have happened here.
Inside the house seems to be beautifully appointed and richly timbered. Someone wealthy must have lived here, but how did it fall into such a state of disrepair?
This is a place where one of the darkest chapters in American history unfolded. But it's also a locale where the actions of one individual of conscience made a significant change in the lives of millions of African Americans.
Local Mayor Griffin Lotson's family worked these fields, and he still feels the history in his bones.
It's darker than 7 nights. Get something ghostly of the past. In our culture, it is called the ancestors. Perhaps they still walk these grounds.
The original owner is a man named Major Pierce Butler. And Major Pierce Butler was a major figure in early American history. He was one of the founding fathers, and he's a kind of enigmatic figure.
After the War of Independence, he acquired this site and he began to grow a crop that was perfect for the wet, hot conditions here, and that would be rice.
The oldest surviving building here is a rice mill, but it was not operated by willing workers.
Now, who actually built this structure is very important to history. It was an enslaved plantation. So every brick, every block you see here was built by those that were enslaved.
Major Butler ended up a major enslaver. He enslaved a great many people across a number of farms and plantations.
The founding fathers, they had wealth, they had power, and they owned slaves.
Major Pierce Butler named this place after himself, and it would remain in his family's hands for generations. This is the Butler Island Plantation.
Butler Island was inherited by Major Butler's grandson, Pierce Mies Butler, who inherited a huge fortune and a great many enslaved people.
But he was not cut out of the same cloth as his grandfather. He was no businessman. He was a drinker and a gambler.
Although there were many cruel slave owners across the South, Pierce Mies Butler was worse than most.
On this plantation, as on most plantations, the enslaved men and women were treated abominably. No one was spared the whip, including pregnant women who had to work in the fields right up until the moment of birth.
At its peak, this plantation had over 900 enslaved workers working its fields. That concentration really made the conditions all the more miserable.
Pierce Mies Butler lived in Philadelphia and was a reluctant traveler to Butler Island. But when he did come, he was not alone.
Pierce Mies Butler fell in love with an English actress named Fanny Kembell, who was the most famous actress of her day.
Despite his opposition, Fanny Kembell persuaded her husband to take her to Butler Island.
So when Fanny Kembell came to Butler Island, she was disgusted by what she saw.
And Fanny Kembell kept a journal while she lived there of the brutality and the violations, the violence that she saw.
And she witnessed it firsthand, and it helped change America's history.
Fanny Kembell's shock at how her husband treated his enslaved workers broke their marriage. And Butler's debts would push his cruelty even further.
Pierce Mies Butler squandered and gambled away his family fortune. And he ended up in debt of about $700,000. In modern terms, that would be $25 million. That was a deep hole.
So he had to make a decision, and his obvious decision was, I would sell some of my enslaved individuals to see if I can get out of debt. And that's what he did. He sold the lives of human beings.
All of the enslaved individuals who belonged to Pierce Mies Butler were put on boats and taken up the coast.
In March of 1859, on the eve of the Civil War, the largest sale of human beings in American history happened on a racetrack in Savannah, Georgia.
Those ancestors of mine that were sold at what we now call the weeping time.
In total, almost 450 men, women, and children were sold. Although at first this seemed like an escape from the cruelty and torture of Butler Island, it only added to their misery.
A lot of their family members would never see each other again, and they felt it. So it was a lot of heartache, a lot of crying.
The two-day sale netted Pierce Mies Butler over $300,000. He decided to celebrate, so he went off on a grand tour of Europe.
But Pierce Mies Butler's now ex-wife, Fanny Kembell, would have her revenge.
Fanny Kembell made the really radical decision in some ways to publish her journals of living on Butler Island. She published them in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, and she was actually inspired by the Emancipation Proclamation.
The journal carefully documented all the atrocities she'd witnessed on Butler Island.
And so it has this national impact in terms of really making people learn something about slavery. It really is a sort of table-turning moment.
This young lady just wrote freely, so I like the pureness of what she wrote and how it helped change America and now the world.
Much of Butler Island was burned during the Civil War, and the plantation fell into ruins. But in the 20th century, this place would get a second chance from a member of the sporting elite.
The Butler family held on to the land for a few more generations, but then it was decided to sell it. The buyer was a man named T.L. Houston, who decided to convert the property into a dairy farm.
Lieutenant Colonel T.L. Houston built this house when he moved to Butler Island.
This particular room here on the Butler Plantation, we call it the Colonel Houston room because this is where he conducted all of his business.
As co-owner of the New York Yankees, Houston's business was baseball.
Houston made the audacious decision in 1919 to purchase Babe Ruth, the most famous slugger in the history of the game, from the Yankees' rivals, the Boston Red Sox.
Babe Ruth, he would travel down here because he was an avid hunter and he loved to hunt ducks.
Rumor has it that Butler Island also played a part in one of America's greatest works of fiction.
The famous novel, Gone with the Wind, about the Old South, is set in Georgia, and many places in the state claim to have been part of Margaret Mitchell's vision. Butler Island is no exception.
With Margaret coming down to this area, most people don't know that writers have their writers' retreat. And it doesn't get much more secluded than these barrier islands here.
Just to the north of Butler Island lies the smaller Rhett's Island, possibly providing the inspiration for Gone with the Wind's protagonist's name, Rhett Butler.
Gone with the Wind is one of the most popular movies ever released. And still, adjusted for inflation, shockingly, it is the highest grossing movie in history.
Rhett Butler's final line as he walks out the door, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," is the most famous film quotation according to the American Film Institute's list of famous quotes.
Even though Butler Island is closely tied to so much history, today it lies derelict. Over 160 years after the end of slavery, the future of Butler Island is uncertain.
Unfortunately, the state of Georgia voted almost 100% to sell the property, sell it for $1 to a distillery. So a lot of courageous people got involved. Myself and many other volunteers from a lot of other distant groups said, we need to save it. History is history. You cannot change it. It is what it is. So let's embrace it. Let's tell the stories for generations to come. Some we need to repeat, and some we need to never do again.
In the Deep South, there's a reminder of America's engineering might. Born out of a world war, it's where man fought the Mississippi.
I was about 2.5 years old when we moved here. We played all over the whole reservation, primarily around where the camp was, and it was a wonderful place.
Just outside of Jackson, there's a relic of an industrial past.
I've never seen anywhere like this. There's all sorts of abandoned structures here. There's what looks like an old water tower, a bunch of pump houses, and loads of rusting equipment just dotting the whole site.
And they're all huge, which makes you think that this place must be owned by the government or some large corporation.
Amongst the battered buildings and corroded pipework, one feature stands out.
As you look past all the vines and the trees that are growing through things, you see this massive amount of concrete. What strikes me is that it doesn't look like a building, it doesn't look like a parking lot, it just looks weird.
Looking at the contours of these concrete slabs, it almost looks like a giant map.
This is the U.S. really scrunched down and walkable. You can walk from Baton Rouge to Louisville in a matter of hours.
Despite being built by the enemy, this site once saved the lives of thousands of Americans.
People that worked here referred to this as the eighth wonder of the world.
Hidden among the pine trees is a forgotten engineering marvel. But Tom Leggett, who first came here in 1947, remembers it a different way.
The happiest memories that I had were just to have such a large expanse, just to roam around. My father worked here, and we lived here when I was a small child. I don't think I really comprehended what it all meant, but everybody that worked here took a lot of pride in what they did.
This structure was born out of an event that shook America.
In 1927, the Mississippi saw one of its worst ever floods, caused by 8 months of solid rain.
As the Great River burst its banks, it flooded a 27,000 square mile area, almost the size of West Virginia.
It was nothing short of catastrophic. In some places, the river grew as wide as 50 miles. People's homes, entire towns were swallowed up by the floodwaters, and it left hundreds of thousands of people without food and without fresh water.
Officially, 246 people died in the floods. But it's near impossible to know how many people actually died, because many African American deaths weren't counted.
Once the waters receded, the estimated cost of the damages in today's money was $1 trillion. Congress vowed it could never happen again.
In response to that 1927 flood, Congress passed the Flood Control Act of 1928. This turned to the Army to tame the Mississippi and prevent that kind of disaster in the future.
The Army's solution was hundreds of miles of tiny channels replicating the Great River. This is the Mississippi River Basin model.
The model out here is like a giant 200-acre puzzle that was put together to replicate the entire Mississippi River Basin.
Stretching from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, the basin covers over 1 million square miles. Operated by dozens of engineers, this model was America's attempt to tame it.
The purpose of this place was to try and accurately model the floods of the Mississippi River, predicting disasters before they struck.
The accuracy that they got is pretty incredible. When they were running historic storms, they were able to be within a tenth of a foot of recorded gauge data.
They had things in the model, such as wire and things like that, to simulate vegetation and snags in the river channel and the floodplain also.
But construction of the model didn't begin for well over a decade. With the Mississippi flowing through 10 states, there were disagreements about how to fund it. And when the model was finally green-lit, America was at war.
It was 1942, World War II is ongoing, so a lot of what would have been the labor force was no longer in the area.
To fight this battle against Old Man River, an unusual army was recruited.
America and its allies had just defeated the Nazis in North Africa. Now, during this campaign, they captured thousands of German POWs. Now, they all needed to be held somewhere, and ideally, put to work.
This was the perfect project for the prisoners because the Geneva Convention said you couldn't use prisoners to build military equipment that would aid in the war. But here was sort of the next best thing. It was aiding in sort of a civilian war against the weather.
A plan was hatched to move thousands of POWs to Mississippi. So a prison camp was built just 2 miles north of the model.
Camp Clinton housed just over 3,000 POWs. Many of them had been hand-picked to work on this model because of their backgrounds in construction and engineering.
My father told me that they were extremely industrious and innovative. They were doing very technical things, and in fact, a lot of the heavy equipment was turned over to the Germans to operate. Normally, you wouldn't have prisoners operating bulldozers and drag lines, but they did here.
But soon, construction would grind to a halt, as on May 8, 1945, the world celebrated Nazi Germany's surrender.
At the end of World War II, the prisoners left, so there was a period of time there really, was, I guess, not a lot going on.
When American workers returned from the war, construction of the model resumed. Thousands of concrete slabs were meticulously placed, representing 41% of the continental United States.
The slabs were constructed in a large hangar-type facility that was located here. And then the slabs were brought out and set in place with a drag line, and they used screw jacks to level the slabs up and then grouted them in.
But before the model could be completed, disaster struck. In 1952, a part of the Mississippi River system threatened to burst its banks in Nebraska, causing catastrophic floods.
Fortunately, this was a part of the model that had already been constructed. So 24-hour tests were kicked into gear, water was run through this thing at a massive rate, all sorts of data was collected, all sorts of predictions were made. And that information was fed back to engineers in Nebraska.
Data such as flood heights and where the levees could fail was collected.
The Nebraska floods proved the Mississippi River Basin model was a huge success. It's predicted that during these floods alone, the model prevented $65 million worth of damage.
14 years later, the entire Mississippi River Basin model was completed. 1 day's worth of real-world information could be collected in just 5 minutes.
What we're seeing over here in what looks like a bridge, actually it would have had a cylinder on top and a probe underneath that would read the water elevation.
In total, 79 full-scale simulations are run, saving countless lives and millions of dollars in damages. But soon, the model would play a leading role in its own downfall.
The completed model was only operational for less than a decade. In 1971, operations came to an abrupt halt when the model was given what would be its final job.
Computer and mathematical models were being devised, but we didn't know if they actually matched what happened. So those models were tested against this place, and when they matched up, it was decided that the concrete could be put to bed.
With the rise of the computer age, the model fell into disrepair. Today, after decades of deterioration, the model is entering a new chapter, having been rediscovered by local engineer Sarah McEwen.
I grew up the child of two engineers. I kind of didn't have a choice but to become an engineer. And when I came out here, my initial thought was, man, this could be such a cool site for school children here locally to visit.
In 2016, Sarah and a group of colleagues set up an organization called the Friends of the Mississippi River Basin Model.
This organization is trying to raise money to restore the site, turn it into a park and an education center.
But until funds are raised, they're left doing all they can to maintain the model in its current state.
We hold monthly cleanup days. It's important to keep this alive because this is the largest scale model in the world. The Mississippi River is really the lifeblood of the U.S. And how this river grows and flows and connects us all is a really important story to tell.
Hidden away in suburban Michigan, on the edge of the Great Lakes, this forgotten building shaped America into an industrial powerhouse.
Certainly there's no one in this area that doesn't know the history of the company that used to be in this building. but they may not realize the importance or significance or the role that it played in larger American or even global history.
The inside of the building holds some clues to its use.
When you're inside, it's this huge open space. What did they need all of this space for?
I mean, it looks to me like it was once a factory, an enormous factory that would have accommodated a lot of people. But the question is, what were they making here?
This was a state-of-the-art factory built with an eye toward the 20th century.
This building's location gives a big hint to what it was used for.
We're in Detroit, Michigan. And if we're talking Detroit factories, then we're talking about cars.
A unique process implemented here would transform manufacturing across the world, but it would come at a cost.
It may not look like it right now, but we're standing in what was the single most important industrial complex of the 20th century.
This was Henry Ford's most revolutionary factory, the Ford Highland Park plant. Matt Anderson, curator at the Henry Ford Museum, knows plenty about Ford and his motors, but has never stepped foot inside this factory.
We're now a century removed from the glory days of this plant, if you will, but still, walking through here, you get a sense of something immense, something important having happened inside this structure.
None of this would have been possible without one engineering prodigy.
Almost from birth, certainly from a very young age, Henry Ford was captivated and fascinated by machinery.
Ford left his family farm at the age of 16 to move to Detroit and become an engineer.
The Ford Motor Company was founded in 1903, and in 1908, they produced their game-changing vehicle, the Model T.
And it was here, at Highland Park, where this vehicle would roll out onto the road.
Henry Ford wanted to create a car for the masses, so it needed to be durable, safe, but also cheap.
Ford realized if a quality car could be built and priced affordably enough, he could tap middle-class Americans and working-class Americans.
But Henry Ford wanted a new style of factory. And so, in 1909, plans were drawn up for the Highland Park plant.
Highland Park gave Henry Ford a chance to design the plant from the ground up with the space that he needed.
This factory opened in 1910 and started churning out Model Ts straight away.
The larger space meant that Ford could bring more of the manufacturing process in-house, increasing efficiency. But Ford knew that he could do more.
If we could turn back the clock and come here 100 years ago, we can imagine what we might have seen. Rails on the ground guiding chassis for Model T automobiles as they move through the plant.
Ford was influenced by the meatpacking facilities in Chicago.
They had been using moving conveyors to move an animal carcass through the plant, and we might think of those as disassembly lines where they're taking parts from the animal apart, and then it comes out in the end as a processed food product.
Henry Ford is credited as being the first to implement this revolutionary process, the moving assembly line. But his concept would almost cause a revolt among his workers.
Some workers describe this as a form of hell, with workers essentially being turned into robots. The worker day lasted about 9 hours, and the pay daily was only about $2.34, which even at that time was quite challenging.
From the moment the assembly line started, workers were leaving the factory in droves. Within a year of the line starting, the company had to replace 90% of its workforce.
To counter the resignations, Ford made a potentially disastrous decision.
To plug the massive holes in its workforce, the company employed vast swathes of recent immigrants, hoping that their precarious positions would make them easier to exploit. But this only led to more problems. The language barrier hindered communications across the line.
But even more than that, people coming from Europe were also bringing with them their socialist ideals, and Ford did not want that.
The awful working conditions across the auto industry in Detroit created a perfect atmosphere for revolt.
Unions were beginning to move in and organize strike action at other factories. Something had to change, and change fast.
Ford realized that you could actually incentivize people more with carrot rather than a stick. So what he did was reduce the working hours for a day from 9 to 8, and also he increased the daily rate from $2.34 to about $5.
Workers were now willing to stay for the job, put up with the tedium and frankly, the drudgery of some of those tasks.
With Ford having his pick of the best workers, he went full throttle at the factory.
The introduction of and the efficiency of the assembly line led to the Model T dropping in price from $850 to $260. Now, in today's money, that would be a drop from $25,000 to $8,000.
And Ford wasn't the only one who benefited.
By increasing his workers' wages, Ford was effectively elevating people from working class to middle class. And with their disposable income, they were spending their money in Detroit, boosting the local economy.
Detroit became a boomtown. 16 years after Ford increased his wages, the population of the city had tripled to more than 1 million people.
But all too soon, it would be time for the Model T to move on down the road.
Highland Park grew very quickly as the Model T becomes more and more successful, and by the early 1920s, they're selling 2 million cars a year. Hard to wrap our heads around those numbers. The last Model T was built in May of 1927. And it was a tremendous run, 19 years of production, 15 million cars built.
However, the Model T wouldn't be the last iconic vehicle to come out of Highland Park.
Once production of the Model T ended at the factory, Ford went back to his farming roots, and he started to use the same principle of the assembly line to manufacture Fordson tractors.
Highland Park continued to manufacture tractors for decades until Ford sold the site in 1981, ending 70 years of auto industry history.
The Highland Park plant has been sitting dormant for over 40 years, with buildings being raised bit by bit.
I think one of the great strengths of Highland Park 100 years ago is one of its great weaknesses today. This is essentially a giant machine, a machine that is fine-tuned and designed to do nothing but build Ford Model T automobiles.
The Model T did what could really only be done once. This was the vehicle that turned cars from a plaything for the rich into the tool that we use every day.
In a sense, in every car that's on the American road today, it owes a little bit of its existence to what happened here in this factory.
On the outskirts of Glendale, in greater Los Angeles, lies a collection of buildings which sustain the spirits of some of show business's leading ladies.
We're in the Crescenta Valley, a place where Hollywood stars and all sorts of fascinating characters have made their home.
Amongst the suburban houses, one group of buildings stands out.
So there's a whole block of what looks like these Spanish-inspired colonial cottages.
Some of the red tiles have fallen. In some place, the roof itself is falling in. But it does seem that someone is making an effort to care for this place.
A lot of people are amazed at how beautiful that it is. My first time inside these gates on this property, I absolutely lost my heart to it. The history, the trees, the feel of this place is so amazing.
This place was set up to counter a terrible trend.
It was often much cheaper and easier to throw your wife into a sanitarium than to go through the process of divorce.
Yet it was connected to one of the most famous movie stars of all time.
The most infamous resident was a woman by the name of Gladys Pearl Ely, and her daughter paid for her care.
The first stone of this compound was laid a century ago, at a time when this valley was booming. This place is currently cared for by Joanna Linkhorst.
I was born and grew up in the Crescenta Valley. There was actually an advertisement at one time from the Crescenta Valley Chamber of Commerce that we had the most healthful air in the world.
This valley would inspire one pioneering doctor.
In 1881, Dr. Benjamin Briggs launched a worldwide search for the perfect place to create a series of sanitariums, places where people with respiratory illnesses, particularly diseases of the lung, could come and live a more healthier life.
Settling on the Crescenta Valley, Briggs chose this place because it was dry, it was clean, really good drinking water.
When people came to California, if they didn't come for gold, they came for their health. Briggs was the one who kind of tamed the West and made it more of a place where houses were being built and not just hunting cabins.
The demand for physical and mental health facilities in California was high, but the focus was not always on patient welfare.
Unfortunately, there was a dark side to this movement in the early 20th century.
Women were more at risk at being thrown into some of these institutions.
It was as simple as going to a pharmacist to say, hey, my wife needs to be put away in an asylum, to get them put away.
This place was built to fight against that oppression.
There are lots of little signs and notices throughout the complex, but one which appears bigger and more important than the others bears the word Rockhaven.
This is Rockhaven, also known as the Screen Actors Sanitarium.
Rockhaven was to be a sanitarium to be run by women, for women only, to give them safe, dignified treatment in a home-like setting.
Founded in 1923 by Agnes Richards, this site has been without residents for almost 20 years, but still has some of its original features.
She put in Murphy beds. One of my favorite things is this is brand new to me. I'd never seen a Murphy bed before this one. And a lot of people come in and say, yeah, my grandma's got one of those.
Agnes Richards was a very powerful, strong woman, and strong women attract strong women. So as a result, she ended up treating a lot of the most famous Hollywood icons.
During the 1920s, Rockhaven cared for the mental health of a number of Hollywood's leading ladies, including Gwen Lee, Billie Burke, and Peggy Fears. But no one was prepared for Rockhaven's most troublesome inmate.
The most infamous resident in Rockhaven was Gladys Baker Ely. One of the reasons was that she felt the need to escape.
Gladys had been in and out of mental institutions, and she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia as well as delusions of persecution.
So this is one of the rooms that Gladys was cared for in. And on one particular occasion, she tied bed sheets together and she went out that window.
Like many of Rockhaven's residents, Gladys's care was paid for by her daughter.
Gladys particularly wanted to escape because she believed that her daughter could look after her better. Her daughter was rich and famous, and her name was Marilyn Monroe.
However, Marilyn never visited her mother at Rockhaven.
Privately, Marilyn Monroe was terrified to go down the same path as her mother. And publicly, Marilyn Monroe's PR team told her to deny any existence of her mother at all.
So from what we know about Marilyn Monroe's early life is that she was only sporadically cared for by her birth mother, had spent time in orphanages, and just didn't have the stability that would have served her as she moved into adulthood.
As Gladys recovered in Rockhaven, Marilyn's star was rising, but the spotlight would take its toll.
She was briefly admitted to a padded cell in 1961, where she was struggling with insomnia as well as extreme exhaustion.
So Marilyn Monroe, of course, was trying to self-medicate, but then she was also heavily medicated by various different doctors.
In 1962, Marilyn Monroe died from a drug overdose.
Even though Marilyn never visited her mother, and even though her mother was a huge absence for much of her life, she still provided for her in her will, leaving a large chunk of her fortune to ensure her mother was well looked after.
Rockhaven allowed her mother to stay there for free until her $100,000 trust fund kicked in to pay for the services.
But as Gladys recovered and moved out of Rockhaven in the late 60s, the sanitarium's whole purpose changed.
Rockhaven decided to start pivoting and make it more about elder care and Alzheimer's and dementia issues, and converted the dorms into the little hospital.
Rockhaven was run essentially as a retirement home until 2001, when rising costs forced it to close.
Rockhaven has been empty and decaying for almost 2 decades. Today, the future for Rockhaven is still unclear.
The city of Glendale stepped in and purchased Rockhaven to prevent the buildings from being demolished, with the hope of turning it into some sort of community park or attraction. Unfortunately, however, with rising costs and different priorities, they've not been able to make good on that intention.
The city of Glendale declared Rockhaven as surplus property in a state of arrested decay.
This is not just what they were calling surplus property. This is our history, and it should be open to everybody. Businesses can come in that I think should have to do with wellness, that have to do with women's businesses, that have to do with benefiting the community.